Hey everyone, Corey Ninja here. Today we're going to go over a beginner-friendly rogue build guide that can help you demolish enemies, elites, and bosses starting with the early game. This build, after a lot of testing, is unbelievably fun to use, and hopefully it can help you get off to a really good start in Diablo 4. Now let's get started on this easy to use guide that will help you dominate all your enemies. This build is primarily about PvE and dealing high damage per second. The whole point of the build is to apply the vulnerable effect to enemies, hit them with shadow imbuement, take them out, and watch them explode one by one. It's pretty satisfying. So to do that, long story short, if you don't have time to watch the full video, what you want to do is get Puncture, upgrade it all the way to the right. That will help apply the vulnerable effect to enemies. Move to Barrage at medium and close distance. Put on Stutter Step to pair critical strikes with movement speed, and we're going to use Caltrops as our trap. Move it all the way to the right and to the top, and our spin is that we're going to put chill damage on top of it. You'll see why later if you stick around. And we have Shadow Imbue. Without it, we can't explode people. Rain of Arrows is the cherry on top, and what it lets us do is explode enemies from the front to the back. We apply Victimize as well. And when it becomes available, combo points will be the specialization. Long story short, you hit enemies 3 times with Puncture to fill up the bar, unleash Barrage on enemies, then rinse and repeat. Okay, so if you haven't fallen asleep by now, congrats, great job, and much appreciated. We're going to move on now to the deeper dive. So our thesis right, we're going to get people to step on our cold Caltrops. Then we're going to hit Shadow Imbue to get those explosives ready. You can hit Shadow Imbue before Caltrops, vice versa, it really doesn't matter. From there we hit them with Puncture to set the vulnerable status, which will help because with Barrage, which has good DPS against both crowds and enemies, we really want to take everyone out fast so that we can start seeing people explode one by one in that sweet chain effect. Then we also spam Rain of Arrows as often as we can. It's just fun to use and cool to see. Okay, let's move on to the deep dive now. Alright, so Puncture. After laying down your trap, when enemies are slowed down, you want to hit them anywhere from close to medium range. Maybe something like shotgun distance, if we want to use analogies here. Again, the key thing, which I can't stress enough, hit them 3 times to activate that combo bar, and then and only then, in most cases, do we want to unleash Barrage. Again, assuming that we already have Shadow Imbue in play already. Barrage has good ricochet effects. I find Barrage more useful than Penetrating Arrow. It gets you that crowd control that you want, but the only drawback is that you have to be a little closer and pretty much face to face. Barrage is significantly more useful against bosses because you're able to hit a boss with 6 arrows, 7 arrows, or 8 arrows, and then I also have Stutter Step. If a critical strikes somebody, I get more movement speed, which is really important to the rogue. And also, before we move into the Shadow Imbuement, I do need to apologize. In order to unlock the Shadow Imbuement, we also need to put some skills into the Subterfuge bucket. Now in the past, I've run Poison Trap a lot, which helped fulfill that requirement, but if you don't want to put any points in that, you can go ahead and put some points into perhaps Exploit and Malice to unlock Subterfuge and be able to move on to the next section and put some points into the Shadow Imbuement. Shadow Imbuement is what brings the fireworks, as we talked about earlier. But instead of M80s, we're talking about the gory, explosive bits of zombies, demons, succubi, and so much more from the world of Sanctuary. Please don't forget to add in the blended and enhanced Shadow Imbuement qualities, because with them, it's so much stronger. Not only do we get to increase our crit chance with enhanced, but the cool thing is, with blended, for those enemies that don't perish in the primary explosion, ones that are hit will become vulnerable, which is the status that drives the center of this build. Primary purpose of this build is to crowd control and take on high level single enemies and bosses. My ultimate skill that I use is Rain of Arrows. Rain of Arrows plus Shadow Imbuement is pretty hilarious. If you're able to get everybody vulnerable, get everyone hit with Shadow, they start exploding on each other. Rain of Arrows just kind of solidifies that. Adrenaline Rush as well, more movement, more energy regeneration. Aftermath. When you use Rain of Arrows, after the fact, you restore 25 energy. So last skill that we apply here, and it's a really important one, we apply Victimize to get even more out of the vulnerable status. So let me explain a little bit. When you apply Victimize, dealing any kind of direct damage to a vulnerable enemy already grants the 30% chance to cause an explosion. Without Victimize, we know that the Shadow Imbuement requires an enemy to be eliminated before the explosion happens. Victimize is kind of a shortcut around that. Back to blended Shadow Imbuement earlier, the reason that Victimize synergizes really well with blended Shadow Imbuement is, on the one hand, in crowds, you take someone out and they explode, that's blended for you. But then their guts kind of spill or splash, however you want to visualize it, onto their friends. It gets them vulnerable, so then they become eligible to get victimized. All you gotta do is maybe land anywhere from 3 to 4 shots, statistically, to get that next explosion without having to actually eliminate the enemy. So it's just really cool to see how these two skills work hand in hand together. I also want to do a quick review of the gear that supplements the build. Gear is always subject to change, but hopefully this tiny breakdown helps to shed some light on what to look for as you continually evolve on this front. And apologies that my voice keeps changing throughout this video. I did a bunch of voice recordings over several different evenings, sometimes half awake, sometimes on way too much coffee. Despite all that, I hope you're getting some value out of this video. And before I forget, please feel free to like and subscribe for more. I'm gonna dedicate this channel solely to Diablo 4, at least until the next big thing comes out. I'm just kidding. Boots are pretty whatever. This effect I don't really care about that much, but it's legendary as well with high armor. This I think is really cool. So if I use caltrops, as you take a look at my abilities again, because I'm using methodical caltrops, like caltrops deal cold damage and chill enemies, and not just slow them, I guess. If you go back to the character, if I damage a chilled enemy with my shadow imbuement here, then there's a really high chance, 75%, that it creates another explosion worth 164 cold damage to the target and to all surrounding enemies. But if you look at this choker, damaging another enemy gives me a barrier worth 767 points of protection. The conceded bone blade compounds with the choker in that when I have a barrier and I hit somebody with this dagger, deals 16% more damage. Returns, nothing, Warren Buffett like crazy, but 16% isn't terrible. This other blade, when I use it quite a lot, I'll leave behind more stunning grenades that theoretically will slow people down. Remaining things, vengeful loop. If I make an enemy vulnerable, I have a higher chance to critical strike them. And finally, barrage is more effective with this ring because barrage's arrows have a 21% chance to split into 2 arrows. The initial plannings are very promising with this cold build. The DPS against both crowds and against elites seem to be pretty high, so that's very encouraging to see. I hope this demonstrates some of the power of Shadow Imbuement plus cold, along with having the right weapons and